Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There is more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 30,772 people from 158 countries and is supported by 427 organisations. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contacts engaged in defending women's rights. We host a range of women from all over the world on this Feminist Question Time and on webinars hosted by country chapters, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, France, the Spanish-speaking countries, Portuguese-speaking countries, and French. So we have a lot of different webinars in different languages. All the women who are on our webinars have signed our declaration or have known histories of feminist activism. But beyond that, we don't know what their exact views are. So we don't know exactly what they're going to say on the webinars. So we want to say that the views expressed by the speakers in these videos and these webinars are not necessarily those of WDI, and we don't necessarily support the views or actions the speakers have expressed or engaged in at other times. As well as the position stated in our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, Women's Declaration International opposes sexism, racism, and anti-Semitism. We have a frequently asked questions button on our website that you can click on to find out more information about that. This week, I'm delighted to say we have Genevieve Gluck from the USA. She's going to talk about porn and the man who invented the trans flag, age regression stuff. We're going to go on to Lynne Harne from the UK, Positively Lesbian. She's going to talk about the website, why it's needed. So it's a new website, Positively Lesbian, language, content, and the way forward. And then Ananda Castano from Spain, who's going to talk about organising lesbian feminism in Spain, obstacles and progress. I'm going to pass over now to Genevieve. Thank you so much. Over to you, Genevieve.
So first, I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. I have a few projects going on at the moment. The first one is Women's Voices, which is a podcast that I do featuring interviews with women's rights activists. And sometimes I do readings from books or texts, excerpts or articles. And then also news discussion. I also have co-founded a website with Anna Slatz called Reduxx. We just got up and running at the beginning of February, and we're putting out articles related to gender ideology news on that topic. And then I have my own personal Substack where I kind of put things that don't really fit into the category of where I would publish otherwise. So things related to certain feminist topics globally, or just something that's been on my mind. Okay, so today, actually, I want to talk about the origins of the trans flag, because I recently read the memoir of the man who designed the trans flag. And then I'm going to kind of explore a little bit more about some of the history of organizing that was going on around the time period of the 60s to the 80s, 90s. And then I'm going to see how that fits into kind of today's queer theory context a little bit. So the man who designed the trans flag identifies as a lesbian and has written forced feminization content, including a story about marrying a young teen girl who does not age. For those who don't know, forced feminization is a porn genre that ostensibly the men are forced to wear women's clothing and pretend to be a woman. It's a whole genre with many other subgenres under it. And so when I say that he's written forced feminization content, I mean that he has certain themes, which I will be showing you from his books. The designer of the trans flag goes by the name Monica Helms. His birth name is Robert Hogg. And he's a veteran of the US Navy. He's from Arizona in the United States, and he's served on 2 submarines. He began cross-dressing on a regular basis after visiting a drag bar while he was stationed in San Diego in 1978. So just to tell you a little bit briefly, I'm sure that we're all aware of how popular the trans flag has become now since its creation in 1999. Hard to believe it's only been a couple of decades, but it's been flown at government institutions, at universities, top universities as well. In the US, at least, I'm aware that it has been flown at elementary schools and preschools. It's featured widely on clothing designs, including clothing designs for children. It's got its own emoji that was fairly recent within the past few years, and it's even, as of the beginning of this year, been placed on the highest peak in Antarctica. This other photo is a picture of the flag being flown outside of MI6. So one of the very first things that he says in his book, in his memoir, More Than Just a Flag, is this strange assertion that he doesn't actually have a gender. So he says, I'm both a man and a woman, neither a man nor a woman, and sometimes both at the same time. I believe I'm enlightened. I identify as female, but I'm more a bi-gender person. This allows my brain to float between multiple worlds. Sometimes I'm a man and a woman at the same time, or I can change back just as fast. So this was something I encountered when reading his works frequently, that there's a sort of religious element to it, almost a mysticism, where he talks about his dreams a lot. So for this next part, I will be showing you some notable excerpts from his memoir, More Than Just a Flag. So it begins with his childhood, and in this passage, he describes stealing his mother's underwear while his parents are out, beginning from the age of 12. And this he refers to as the girl in the shadows. So he refers to himself in the third person as a girl. And here he describes how this became a ritual for him. Whenever I found myself alone at home and nothing else occupied my time, I would head for my mother's dresser. This is a frequent pattern that has been seen in male fetishists, particularly if you look at stories from trans widows. Their partners will often talk about stealing their wives' underwear for sexual purposes. By the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning that some of the content I'll be discussing is a little bit sensitive, including things that might be traumatizing for survivors of child sexual abuse. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so another excerpt from his memoirs. He goes into great length talking about women in this book. I haven't pulled all of the passages that I found to be interesting, because there were quite a lot of passages that had to do with his dating and a certain animosity he had towards women, especially when he was in his younger adulthood, where he had some anger about not being able to lose his virginity. Anyway, so that's why I highlighted this passage here, because now we're getting to the part where he's turning his cross-dressing into a more full-time identity. And he says that since I had already had a few sexual experiences with women, I no longer obsessed about losing my virginity. Instead, I began to revisit those childhood feelings. So here he is at a laundromat at his apartment complex, and he steals a woman's underwear, takes it home with him, and uses it for sexual purposes. He says, I enjoyed wearing it. Was I a pervert? I didn't know. All I knew was that this felt exciting. It felt liberating, and I wanted more. This time, however, I would be sure to buy the clothes I wanted rather than stealing them. So then at this point, he makes the decision to go all in and begins to buy women's clothing. He talks about his shopping spree, how he stands in front of a mirror in women's clothing, and then says, the feelings I had dressed as a woman ran the gamut of human emotions. Sexual excitement topped the list of what came over me while wearing women's clothes. This passage refers to a time when he's begun going to drag bars now. And in this particular passage, he's talking about an experience he had with one of the drag performers. He went home with the drag performer, and they dressed up together and engaged in sexual acts together. It was around this time period that Helms began dating the woman he would go on to marry, named Donna, and she strongly disapproved of his fetish. 6 months into the marriage, I found out just how Donna really felt about my cross-dressing. She came home one day and found me wearing a dress. She went ballistic. She was very upset and told me in no uncertain terms that I would never dress like that at home ever again. Throughout the course of their marriage, Helms continued to pursue his sexual fetish against his wife's wishes, spending family finances on clothing, makeup, and hormones. He also invested in attending get-togethers or holiday and femme with other male cross-dressers where lessons were provided on how to talk and walk like a woman. At this point, I would like to introduce you to what's called the Tri-S Society. So I'm going to go off a little bit on this tangent about the Tri-S Society. So this was a group of male cross-dressers that began organizing across the US during the 70s through the 90s. And Tri-S means 3 S's. So the Society for the Second Self. They referred to themselves as sororities without women and named their local chapters as though they were college sororities. They also would refer to themselves as college girls or pretend to be college girls. So Helms himself started a local chapter in Arizona after hearing about the organization on television. So I became really interested in this, and I looked into some digital archives for more information about Tri-S, which also goes by Tri Sigma, keeping with the college name theme. And these are easy to find when you know where to look for them. These are some scans of pamphlets that they would put out. I'm showing you these 2 in particular because the one on the left has this cartoon. I don't know if you can see, but at the bottom it says, Agatha ironed the paisley print shirt waister with the ruffle. I'm getting dressed up tonight. So it's the wife doing all of the housework while the husband is relaxing in the bathtub, telling her to get his clothing ready for him to dress up. There are lots of comics like this in the newsletters, by the way, poking fun at women and pointing out the fact that they're still doing the housework while the men are dressing up. And then here's another cover. Femme Mirror is the name of one of the publications, and reflecting the feminine. These were press releases that were published within the newsletter, talking about their organization. Group helps transvestites to find peace of mind, a sorority without women. And it describes how the Society for the Second Self exists in particular to help the heterosexual male transvestite. So they were exclusionary and they would not allow homosexual men into the organization. They were very concerned with keeping up appearances of not actually being sexual and trying to keep that hidden. So that's one reason why they wouldn't allow homosexual men into the group. Another reason is because they were specifically targeting housewives to accept the male fetish, and they would try to bring the women in to the organization, which I will show you more later. But specifically, I'm showing this clip because we have a quote here from Virginia Prince, who is the co-founder of the Tri Sigma, the Society for the Second Self, a sorority dedicated to making femininity accessible to all people. They treated this as a kind of finishing school. They would refer to it as a way to train to become feminine. Here's a photo of Virginia Prince. Virginia, whose real name is Arnold Prince. It says founder here, it should say co-founder, that's my mistake. So co-founder of Tri-Sig, was also an advisor to Harry Benjamin for his 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. This is a quote from a publication by Prince. He published magazines called Transvestia, and I'm highlighting 2 quotes of his for the particular focus here on taking the organizing strategies of the gay and lesbian community, referred to as the gay and lesbian community, is on the march and on the way to gaining acceptance. Some of the more narrow-minded of our sister TVs, which is transvestites, see nothing good in anything that homosexuals do, but we ought to remember that their persecution is our persecution and their victory will be our victory too. So personally, I am all for their success and would cooperate in helping them to achieve it where I could, out of pure self-interest for our group, if nothing else fails. So this is a cover of Transvestia Prince's publication, and he would frequently attend these organizations for the securing of gay and lesbian rights in the US during the 60s in order to observe their tactics. I think it is in order that we keep an observer status in this field and stand by to aid their cause when it will aid ours, and to extract from their experiences and their contacts with authorities and influential groups any contacts and opportunities that may be to our advantage. Okay, so as for Prince, there's a lot of information about him. He was extremely influential. I went on a bit of a tangent there about him just because to highlight the fact that he was heavily involved in Tri Sigma, as well as the creator of the trans flag. Here are a few clips from the newsletter from Tri Sigma or Tri S. Here we have a man holding a sign crossed out from gender dysphoria to say gender euphoria, which these days online has become something of a euphemism for sexual fetishes or arousal. Here we have a photo of male cross-dressers lined up, joking about being strip searched as though they were prisoners in jail. This particular caption, you can see that it's wishing sexual assault on their critics. So as I was reading their newsletters, I would frequently find animosity towards women who didn't accept their fetish. Men would write in letters, for example, about things that they would want to do to their wives if they didn't accept what they were doing. So this caption basically describes one of her critics had blown all 4 tires of her car when she was driving in a downtown area of New York City, and she was only wearing a bra and panties at the time. It's a bit disturbing. I'm sorry about that. And then here another caption where they're comparing themselves to prostituted women. I have talked in the past about something called sissy captions, which are the modern equivalent of this. So I'm pointing this out of interest for the fact that this is an ongoing trend that goes back decades, actually. I had kind of thought this was a new phenomenon. But when I say sissy captions, I mean something quite like this, like a photo. These days, usually it's the photo of women, not cross-dressing men, and some sexualized content with it. And a few more clips from their publications, which I'm highlighting here to show the involvement of children. So here you have the father figure dressed up making his son dress up in women's clothing. They've actually done it to a real child here, I believe. No way to know for certain, of course, because sometimes it might actually be a real girl that they've used, but anyway. And then some of the comics. Now go to sleep, and tomorrow Daddy will tell you about his trip and fam to New York. And then another comic making fun of the housewife. How come you take off your dress whenever there's work to be done? Okay, so here it's a focus on the child, which was a disturbing aspect of this, which I'm going to explain in more detail coming up. But here you can see they would write poetry. Often the poetry might be about doing makeup or shopping or something very stereotypical like this. Sometimes it might be criticizing women who don't do such things and putting them down. But then you get sometimes these strange references to children, be a little girl again, and talking about a young girl enjoying her femininity. Okay, so here's a letter from one of the members, ostensibly. So joining Tri-S and the chapter has been about the best thing I've done for myself. I'm so pleased to receive the copies of our special Joy, the newsletter. You gals really did a number on my wife at my first meeting. She was skeptical when she agreed to go, but we had a wonderful evening. It's important to remember that in the US, women were not capable of financial independence until the 60s. And it wasn't until there was an Equality Credit Act in 1974 that discrimination from banks against women was made a legal reality. So when we're talking about women being coerced into going along with this with their husbands, it's important to remember that they might often have been forced to do so financially. And then again, here we have another comic making fun of the wife who is clearly not feminine enough, doing all of the laundry for the husband. And then this clip over here, which I had highlighted to show the fact that this is the heterosexual cross-dressing support. They were very adamant, like I said, about excluding homosexual men. This led me down to another path of looking at these, the porn magazines that were being published at around this same time, again, from the 60s to the 80s. So this is from 1988. This is called the Sissy Times. It gives instructions about what these men should be doing in order to present as women. I've put, pay attention to this, I will be mentioning this later, but cross-dressing, petticoat punishment, corset discipline, male submission, humiliation, female superiority, and dominance. So these are all factors of BDSM. Petticoat punishment refers to the forced dressing in lingerie, for example. And here we have a quote saying that they ought to mimic the female menstrual cycle and being given lessons on how to do so. Often with this sissy porn culture, it revolves around being given tasks and assignments and things to do. And then, of course, you know, things like cleaning the house that they might be asked to do, which they would intentionally do poorly in order to be punished. But there's other things within as well, like keep a diary of your feminine thoughts, read women's magazines and books, cultivate a feminine hobby, all of these kinds of things that they're being asked to do. But it goes back even before the 80s. So this is circa 1962, the Female Mimics International magazine. In the back of these cross-dressing magazines, you might have advertisements for estrogen, female hormones, as well as I've highlighted here for books on fetishism, particularly sadomasochism. Here's a few more just examples of that. The BDSM pornography books that were advertised in the back of cross-dresser magazines. You'll notice here again the theme about jail, girls' punishment at school of discipline, male captives forced into female attire. All of this is very relevant to the fact that, as I pointed out before, there was a jail theme about being, well, ostensibly it's the threat of being raped while in jail. So the element of sexual violence being thrilling, quite obvious here. Another cross-dresser magazine from that time period, the Journal of Male Feminism. So I was thinking about this, and I actually started to wonder if this wasn't some kind of backlash to the sexual liberation movement of Europe and the Americas in the 1960s, because this all seems to have started just after that through the 60s up into the 80s. And even the element of something such as male feminism, it seems to me that history is repeating itself. So within these cross-dresser publications, what they were doing is saying that they were being proper feminists by encouraging femininity, which is something that we see repeating today in the gender ideology. Those who write on this topic, for example, Julia Serrano, will talk about the scapegoating of femininity as though femininity is being wrongfully portrayed as a problem problem for women and that we just need to embrace it and empower ourselves with it. So I just thought that was interesting because it seems like a backlash to the women's movement and then repeating itself again today. I was pointing that out for the purpose of giving you some more context about Monica Helms because he was involved with these cross-dressing organizations. So I do want to return now back to the main topic about Monica Helms. So he had written in his book that he had told his wife about his cross-dressing before he proposed, but then also admits that she denied this. Anyway, it led to a breakdown in their marriage. And ultimately, it was him, not his wife, who decided to end the marriage. And he did so because she was just uncomfortable with his fetish. He says that she made hateful comments about his breast growth. So after their divorce was finalized in 1999, he began frequenting Arizona's sex clubs, which afforded patrons the chance to watch people have sex in windowed rooms. Helms tells of how these clubs enabled me to fulfill each and every fantasy I had concerning sex with men. This included orgies, hot tubs, you name it. I spent several months visiting these clubs. During that time, I had oral and anal sex with men on multiple occasions. I wanted to have sex with women too, but the opportunity never presented itself, he says. And then he says that Stanley Kubrick's film Eyes Wide Shut seemed tame compared to what he was doing in these sex clubs. Then he says that after he got that out of his system, he began to identify as a lesbian woman. He began attending lesbian clubs 3 to 4 times a week from 1999 to 2000. And he also authored short stories with sexual themes, including forced feminization, wherein men are transformed into women as a humiliating punishment. In this next excerpts I'm going to show you are from his science fiction book, Tales from a Two-Gendered Mind. So he has this story called Sexual Harassment, where a man begins cross-dressing with his wife's clothing. The wife is killed tragically in a car accident. I've put here, this is a common theme. It's very common in forced feminization erotica for the wife to be killed off, and then, surprise, the husband turns into the wife and takes over her identity. So here, this is an excerpt from where he's using her clothing for his fetish. Then he starts to feel as though he's being taken over and he has no control over himself. In this story, actually, it's the ghost of the wife doing it to him because it's always a woman's fault, right? And then he goes on to go to gay clubs and have sex with men, pretending to be his wife, even using his wife's name. In another story, it features 2 lesbians who arrive at a gas station. This is a body snatching story where the women begin to age rapidly, and the 2 older, then 2 women at the gas station become younger. So they swap bodies. It goes on to describe in sexual terms the body swapping, and then at the very end of the story, there's a veiled threat to his wife, Donna, as one of the characters that this is going to happen to next shows up. So then he has this other story about a child that never ages. It's called A Woman Scorned, and it features a man in Arizona. As he is from Arizona, it's clearly meant to be him. A child comes and knocks on his door and basically is stalking him and says that she has to marry him. He mistakes her for a 16-year-old girl. She then tells him, "No, I'm a witch. I just never age." Which, by the way, this is also kind of a common theme in some anime that features children as well. And then it ends with this really kind of creepy, they have a daughter that looks like him and then has that same power. So here we have the fantasy of the man being turned into a little girl as part of the age regression. So Helms was 48 when he designed the trans flag in 1999. He has claimed that the stripes came to him by way of divine intervention, but the color scheme is often seen repeated in other contexts. According to researcher Dr. Sarah Good, pedophiles who organize online have developed their own culture, language, and symbols. One common symbol used is the baby blue, pink, and white stripes. And here I've taken this from her lecture, which you can find on YouTube. These logos, which I have double-checked for myself just to be certain I'm not propagating any kind of conspiracy theory, they are on pedophile forums. I've seen it myself. This is not on the dark web. You can find this in a couple of clicks. And these logos go back to as early as 1997, predating the flag. Areas in Europe that have advertised child sex trafficking and been busted by organizations have used these color codes to advertise as well. And it's not clear whether Helms was aware of this correlation at the time. I'm not saying for sure that this was on purpose. However, it seems a bit coincidental to me, and he's often repeated that the colors were meant to represent baby boys and baby girls. And here we can see it flying at a preschool in the US. And then here we see the color scheme repeated on a pro-pedophile forum. I just want to show you a couple examples of these age regression erotica that are available on Amazon. Again, just a couple of searches. You can find these on Amazon for sale. Transgender forced feminization involving children. They often use these pseudonyms as well. Mary Martin, for those who don't know, refers to an actor who played Peter Pan. Dr. Christina Richards has called for the normalization of age play, furry fetishes, and sadomasochistic practices as further sexualities. Richards serves on the European Professional Association for Transgender Health and on WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. He has presented a lecture talking about how age play should be normalized. This is a quote from a writing of Richards that has to do with age regression. Terms which may be encountered here include daddy's little girl, in which an older male treats a younger female bottom as a child. The term sissification intersects with age play, as it is where an adult male is consensually forced to don the clothes of and behave as a young girl as part of a BDSM scene. So I'm highlighting this to really kind of hammer home that I'm not quite convinced that this is a total coincidence about Monica Helms, the trans flag, the age regression. I'm very skeptical. And also, I just wanted to announce that I do have an investigation coming up soon that I've been working very hard on, where I have found that WPATH has been collaborating for over 10 years with a fetish website. Content featured on the website includes child pornography, also called child sexual abuse materials, of an extreme sadomasochistic nature, very including torture, bestiality, snuff, just awful. So here's an example of a screenshot from the written pornography. By the way, it's all written. That's how they get around the law. Written pornography of this nature is legal in the US. So there's over 3,000 stories on this website that particularly focus on children and especially on the castrating of children. And then here's a screenshot from one of those stories that's rated G, or the lightest one, which talks about lowering the age of consent to 12. So every time I see something like puberty blockers for children, it's all I can think about now, these types of age regression fetishes and the content that I've seen in the written format. It disturbs me very greatly. And once you know where to look for these things, you can pretty much find them easily. This one was on Twitter, where this man was excited about children being put on hormones and had posted it along with child sexual abuse materials. And then I just wanted to link this back to John Money, who had been published in a pedophile journal, basically apologizing for pedophilia, saying that it's not pathological in any way. This is part of an article that was published in the Histories of Sexology by a current pro-pedophile activist who is a gender studies professor at the University of Amsterdam. His name is Gert Hekma. I wrote about him on my Substack. And he here describes how the movement during the 70s and 80s to normalize certain male fetishes all were successful except for the pedophile movement, which he goes on to say was a result of a growing feminist concern. So this was in the Netherlands, but this follows the same pattern that happened in Germany as well, where during the 70s and 80s, they tried to lower the age of consent. And it was women who pushed back against this, but have largely been forgotten. They were slandered terribly at that time for doing so. According to Alice Schwarzer, who says that they went through all kinds of abuse for pushing back against this. This is from an article she wrote in 2010. She is the founder of the German publication Emma, a very well-known German feminist. She says, from today's perspective, it seems hard to believe that Emma was the only voice back then who opposed it with force. So they managed to prevent the decriminalization of pedophilia, essentially lowering the age of consent to 12. And I wanted to kind of wrap this up with her comment, because I believe it is incumbent on us now to know that that is coming. That is what is being pushed. That is what will be pushed if it's not already where you are, and that we need to be ready for it. And we are going to be slandered horribly for it, as we already are, but that we need to be aware of the history of this. I, looking into this now, believe more than ever that history is repeating itself, and that the next thing coming will be to lower the age of consent. Everything I've seen and I believe talked about just now points to that, in my opinion. I have been speculating if pornography is a kind of causing a social contagion, perhaps increasing fetishism. It appears to be the case from my experience looking at anecdotal evidence online. I am not familiar with any kind of research into that has happened recently, but it would not surprise me given that we have seen social contagions on TikTok, for example, the whole gender movement itself being a kind of a social contagion. But I do wonder to what extent we're actually seeing an uptick in this behavior because of streaming pornography, and what it is that we can do to fight it. Now, I don't have an answer to that. My only strategy has been to promote awareness, because I think that not enough people are aware that this is going on. And certainly we have the problem that these behaviors are being presented to us as though they are innate, which is false in my view. Contestable, I know, but I think so. So I think that that would be the next thing to consider going forward as well, in addition to watching out for the lowering of age of consent, which I think will be introduced as a way of introducing gender affirming care under that guise. So that's what I wanted to say.
We're going to hear from Lynne Harne from the UK. She is a lesbian feminist activist, founder, member of Lesbian Rights Alliance, an organisation campaigning to stop lesbian erasure. Recently, she's been working with a small group of younger lesbians to create a website and youth project aimed at young lesbians, now known as positivelylesbian.org.
The first thing I want to say is that I'm speaking on behalf of the young lesbian feminists who created this website, but can't be public as yet because of their jobs and so on. Our motivation for creating the website very strongly was to address the attempts that have been made to disappear lesbians, really, and make us invisible. And this started with the queer movement. The queer movement was saying that in the UK, this started at the sort of end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. And the queer movement said that lesbians had to call themselves queer, be open to sex with men, and worship the penis, basically. And then we had the transgender, well, really the popularization of the transgender movement through Organize like Stonewall, and who changed same-sex attraction into gender attraction. And we had the ludicrous situation of cross-dressing men identifying as lesbians and calling their penises lady sticks. And of course, now trying to, as you we've seen in the previous talk, insisting that they have sex with real lesbians, material lesbians. And the other side of this was that lesbians who didn't conform to sexist stereotypes of girls and women had to call themselves men born in the wrong bodies. And we know this has caused untold harm to probably thousands of lesbian bodies, irreversible harm. And this is all coming out through detransitioner accounts and research now on detransitioners who are mainly lesbian detransitioners. In the Lesbian Rights Alliance, we did, of course, start resisting this. And there was lesbian resistance from Get the L Out, for example, in protesting at Pride marches and so on. And then there was the creation of the Lesbian Strength Marches, which used to happen in the second wave. And in terms of the Lesbian Rights Alliance, in 2018, we went to meet up with the Government Equality Office to talk about discrimination against lesbians. And this was myself and 3 of the young lesbians I'd met through radical feminist connections, mainly at a radical feminist conference, I think, which was about 2016, where I ran a workshop called Tomboys Not Allowed. So it was me and these 3 young lesbians saying to the Government Equality Office, there's discrimination, particularly against young lesbians. There are hundreds of LGBT youth groups, but there's nothing for young lesbians. There isn't a single youth group for young lesbians, and that is what is needed. And then the Equality Office turned around and said, "Oh yes, there is a lesbian youth organisation. It's called the Proud Trust." And we soon found out that the Proud Trust wasn't a lesbian organisation at all. It was a transgender organisation promoting gender identity ideology. But it had been awarded nearly £100,000 for a 3-year project to train teachers in schools. And this was supposed to be for disadvantaged lesbian and bisexual young women. What the Proud Trust did, and it's still operating today and promoting gender identity ideology, etc., is began to educate teachers into various normalizing practices. For example, it was saying that girls should accept having anal sex with boys. It was assuming that the materials that they were producing were sort of for bisexual or heterosexual children. There's nothing wrong with engaging in BDSM and kink. It said pornography was perfectly normal. Children should watch pornography because they could learn from it. This particular teaching program was aimed at children aged 11 to 12. And you can see in this slide that the most notorious thing about this, and an article was published in the Times about it, is that it's got these hands and fingers, penis mouth. And if a child tossed the dice, there had to be a conversation about how penises were used, how hands and fingers were used. On one of the other sides, it's also got objects, the use of objects in sex and so on. And I think that this program is probably still going, even though the Minister of Education said he objected to it. So this is a type of thing that the Proud Trust and loads of other pro-trans and transgender organisations are taking into schools now. This is what children are being taught, as well as being taught, that if you're a girl, that you don't like dolls and pink, you're really a boy, you can change sex very easily, and so on. When we started to set up the Positively Lesbian project, which was initially called the Labris project, we looked for funding for it because we decided we had to do it for ourselves, that we weren't going to get any help from government. We did originally apply to an organisation called Lush, which at the time were funding women-only organisations, and that had funded the Lesbian Immigration Support Group. But of course we got turned down, even though they didn't tell us that we got turned down, why we got turned down, because they thought trans activists might be offended. So then what happened is that we raised funds for it through GoFundMe in 2020, when lockdown was mainly going on, and started to develop the website in 2021, and it was launched in the late summer of 2021. So what we had to counter in developing the website was, what is a lesbian, basically in terms of men calling themselves lesbian and so on. It was really important that we talked about lesbianism being about women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to other females only, and that some lesbians know that they're sex attracted at a very young age, others discover this later in life, and some call themselves bisexual before they decide they're lesbians. And it was really also important that we highlight compulsory sexuality, because many young girls and young women, although they maybe perhaps have crushes on other girls at school, feel that they've got to comply to heterosexuality. That's the only normal sexuality. So they have to comply with it. And before they've really had any experience to have relationships with other women. So we just wanted to reassure young women that it's okay to be unsure about your sexuality. But we have had, in terms of young lesbian responses to the site, we have had young lesbians contacting us saying they are still confused about their sexuality because of what they've seen on social media forums such as Reddit and Tumblr. And on Reddit, all they can see is forums which are full of what they call transbians. But on Tumblr, there are also the extreme lesbian view, if you like, is that you can't be a lesbian or even call yourself a lesbian unless you've started to know that you're a lesbian from the age of 3, for example, and you have to call yourself bisexual, and you can never be a lesbian unless you know that you're a lesbian from a very young age. And we don't, in terms of the website, that is not the message that we're promoting. We're saying that any young woman can decide to be a lesbian, even if she has had previous sexual relationships with men, and she can call herself a lesbian. Obviously, if she's sexually attracted to them, because we've also had other young lesbians saying, choosing to be a lesbian means that you have to force yourself into same-sex attraction. And of course, that's absolute rubbish. you only want to become a lesbian if you do feel attracted to other women. It's not something that's forced at all. Of course, we all know that the male gender identity movements say that sex doesn't exist, etc., and it's not a material reality. And we just wanted to reaffirm that it is a reality. It's the body you're born with. There's only two categories, sex categories, female and male, and there are a very small number of people with intersex conditions, but they still fall into these two categories. And also, to be clear, very much about what gender is, the social stereotypes, they're not stereotypes in your brain, which you're born with. So masculinity for men and femininity for women. And to really say that all women are born in the right body, basically, rather than the ideology that they have to be men because they're born in the wrong body. It was also very important to us to address all the attacks and so on from men who are pretending to be women, who are entering lesbian dating sites, and also in queer ideology being told that they must accept these men and be prepared to have sex with these men. And if you go on these, there are some specific sites which say that they are specifically aimed at lesbians, but that's not the case. We didn't find a single dating site which said that they would exclude men pretending to be women or exclude men claiming to be women. That those sites apparently don't exist. And if you're a young lesbian and you protest saying, I only want a relationship with a woman, you're likely to be thrown out of the site. So this is one example that one or two of the young lesbians in our group have used is Hinge, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily won't come across a man when they meet up. And so we put in all these guidelines about staying safe and how it's fine to be, if it's a man or you don't like the woman you're meeting up with, just to say, no, I don't want to carry on, or I don't want this to carry on. So those are the messages it's been really important for us to give. It was particularly important to us to show that there is a female, that for lesbians, relationships are about sexual relationships in particular, about giving pleasure to each other through mutable relationships. To also highlight that things like a hierarchical sexual relationship, which comes from what women have got, lesbians may have learned from gay men, is about, tops and bottoms and so on. One is a person in power, and one is the person who lacks power in the sexual relationship. So those are the sorts of things that we've put on the website. And we particularly wanted to, it's not here, but we did have a picture of the clitoris and where it is and so on body issues, and I think it was in the relationships part of it. The responses to the website, they've been overwhelmingly positive internationally, and thanking us for doing the website. And we also have been recently in touch with further education colleges and schools girls only schools at the present time to be asked to come and talk about being lesbian. And so that's one of the things in the future that we're going to do, and set up a group who are willing to go and talk in schools. Lesbians, probably under 40, not lesbians my age, to go and do that. And we only had one response which said they thought our site was transphobic because we should have something about how it's okay to be trans because some young women benefit from it, and obviously we're not going to do that.
So Ananda Castano is from Spain. She's going to talk to us about organising lesbian feminism in Spain and obstacles and progress. Ananda is a lesbian feminist activist, 29 years old, woman with disabilities, chronic illnesses. She's a lesbian separatist, writer and poet, currently working on the radical feminist press Labris editorial. Ananda is a member of Radfem Sevilla and lesbian feminist groups such as Reazione Lesbica and Lesbianas della Munda, and the consciousness raising group Reflexione Lesbica.
Hola a todas. Me pidieron que hablase hoy de los problemas que las lesbianas feministas enfrentamos cuando intentamos organizarnos entre nosotras. Así que de eso vengo a hablaros. De eso y también de cómo las feministas lésbicas hemos superado esos problemas o estamos intentando superarlos. Existen obstáculos para generar una organización que se mantenga en el tiempo, que son específicos de las lesbianas, pero la mayoría de los problemas que tenemos forman parte de los problemas generales para organizarse del movimiento feminista actual, o se derivan directamente de ellos. Comenzaré hablando de algunos. Vale. Distingo 4 problemas clave. Problemas propios de una nueva ola de conciencia feminista, el borrado de la genealogía feminista, la hegemonía de la perspectiva del liberalismo sexual y el intento de colonización por parte de los hombres. Los problemas propios de una nueva ola de conciencia feminista serían la falta de espacios de organización propios ya establecidos. Las lesbianas feministas, las asambleas feministas, aquellos espacios erigidos desde hace años en algunos lugares para acciones como organización del 8 de marzo, han estado casi en su totalidad tomadas por organizaciones queer o transactivistas y de manera velada por distintos intereses de partidos políticos u otras organizaciones e instituciones. En el caso de los espacios exclusivamente de lesbianas, estos ya apenas existen y los que tenían un marcado carácter feminista ya no lo tienen. Destaco el caso de un local fundado por una de las grandes feministas lésbicas de España, ya fallecida, en el que recientemente se ha decidido no tratar temas de feminismo o de ningún carácter político por las influencias y las amenazas de transactivistas. Pese al interés de muchas feministas lésbicas y muchas mujeres feministas en general de volver a politizarlo. En general, el movimiento ha dependido en gran medida de las redes sociales. Y las mujeres que llegan al movimiento se encuentran en estas plataformas con el hecho de que no hay iniciativas claras de organización a las que adherirse. Las iniciativas de organización que van creándose son proyectos espontáneos surgidos del contacto online y local entre mujeres afines al movimiento, motivadas por una necesidad de espacios seguros para expresar sus vivencias y opiniones gendercríticas, abolicionistas de la prostitución o feministas radicales, más que por objetivos de movilización o intervención política concretos. Estos espacios de organización han tardado en llegar y muchos se han disuelto. Se han disuelto pronto por diferencias de opiniones y la falta de concreción de objetivos, 2 factores que son una mala mezcla. Estos fenómenos se producen en gran parte debido a que las mujeres que llegan al movimiento están en el inicio de su concienciación feminista. A veces esto implica dar espacios a premisas muy alejadas del feminismo radical y más cercanas a los puntos de vista hegemónicos en el patriarcado, y estar continuamente reinventando la rueda, y puede acabar logrando que las mujeres más concienciadas no se sientan cómodas o sufran hostilidades desde grupos de mujeres que aún no están preparadas para afrontar las duras verdades del feminismo radical. Las mujeres no solo no saben cómo organizarse por falta de experiencia, sino que inician dinámicas individualistas y de búsqueda de relevancia, basadas en los patrones sociales patriarcales, hemos presenciado la instauración de un sistema de estrellas influencers, de grupos de afinidad despolitizados y acríticos, y de una gran presencia de carrerismo dentro del movimiento. Fenómenos que se han normalizado en parte por esta falta de alternativas de organización y de carencia de foros específicos para el feminismo, pero también por una manifiesta falta de compromiso con la teoría y de praxis feminista. Una falta de valores en la que las mujeres tienden a ser permisivas con la reproducción del patriarcado entre nosotras. Esto hace que las lesbianas nos encontremos con un ambiente supuestamente feminista que es, por ignorancia, hostil a nuestro feminismo, que parte de un fuerte radicalismo. Desarrollaré este punto más tarde. Otro problema es el borrado del feminismo radical, a través, por ejemplo, de la institucionalización. En España sufrimos una pérdida de espacios exclusivos de mujeres debido a la dependencia de las ayudas gubernamentales. Tal como narra Sheila Jeffries en Gender Hard, que ha ocurrido en otros lugares. Esto ha hecho que se desradicalicen los espacios que ya estaban constituidos y que puedan ser tomados por la ideología queer o trans o meramente por un feminismo descafeinado que mantiene a las mujeres en la rueda del patriarcado. El movimiento feminista radical de España también sufrió una institucionalización en los años 80 en la que intercambiamos los espacios de construcción por puestos en los consejos gubernamentales y en los partidos políticos de los hombres. Existe en nuestro país, a raíz de esto, una suerte de imaginario de que los logros feministas se hacen desde esta política y que la praxis feminista es exclusiva o mayormente a través de estas instituciones. La academia es otra de las grandes instituciones de borrado del feminismo radical y por ende del lésbico. También se refleja aquí el análisis de Sheila de que muchas académicas durante años no opusieron resistencia a la entrada de la doctrina queer y del posmodernismo en sus aulas. Y además, en el caso de España, en la academia apenas hay rastros de la genealogía radical y menos de la lésbica. Para hacernos una idea del borrado del feminismo lésbico, quisiera reseñar que una de las figuras más influyentes de la escena académica feminista española hacía en su último libro una especie de chiste que venía a decir que ser feminista y ser lesbiana no está relacionado en ningún modo, que es un absurdo intentar buscar conexiones en estas dos vivencias. Otro hecho destacable es que una de las principales fuentes de consulta de nuestro movimiento, una de las feministas más divulgadas de nuestro país, da una visión de la historia del feminismo radical usando como fuente principal a Alice Eccles. Sheila Jeffries, en Anticlímax, critica y cuestiona duramente las afirmaciones de Eccles sobre el feminismo radical y el feminismo lésbico, y critica la categoría de feministas culturales que Eccles intentó imponer sobre una gran cantidad de feministas radicales y lesbianas. Sin embargo, estas afirmaciones no son contrastadas en el feminismo español y se presentan a quienes pretenden introducirse en el feminismo radical unas visiones del feminismo lésbico que provienen de una libertaria sexual. Que se logre borrar el feminismo radical se debe también en gran parte a la falta de acceso a fuentes que dejen registro del mismo. El feminismo radical no fue un fenómeno exclusivamente del mundo angloparlante. En nuestro territorio también se desarrolló, pero ha quedado sepultado por estas dinámicas de institucionalización y los libros que lo recogían en gran parte fueron descatalogados, las revistas desaparecieron. Sin embargo, muchas mujeres de esta nueva ola sí sabemos inglés y pudimos acceder a fuentes de conocimiento radical y lésbico que no estaban tan enterradas en el contexto feminista de ese idioma. También otras muchas tuvimos la suerte de llegar a esa herejía lesbiana cuya traducción sigue circulando entre nosotras pese a su descatalogación. Con este conocimiento, las lesbianas entendimos lo revolucionario de nuestra posición política. Como feministas, buscamos hacer a todas las mujeres tomar conciencia de lo opresivo de la heterosexualidad y la posibilidad de derribar esa institución desde el movimiento. Es aquí donde se presentaron la mayoría de nuestros problemas más específicos. El liberalismo sexual. El liberalismo sexual es una de las mayores fuentes de ideas hegemónicas que hacen que el feminismo radical no pueda avanzar debido a una fuerte negativa de las propias feministas a examinar sus dogmas. La sacralización de la sexualidad desde perspectivas individualistas y despolitizadas es una tendencia profundamente contraria a las bases del feminismo radical y, como ya ocurrió históricamente en los 80 y 90, tiene su mayor choque con los análisis feministas lésbicos. En la actualidad, el liberalismo se vale de una nueva herramienta para despolitizar la sexualidad y ocultar lo opresivo de ella, el concepto de la orientación sexual. Muchas de las mujeres del movimiento se aferran a este concepto e interpretan los análisis lésbicos que no casan con él como un ataque personal, llegando a comparar la teoría lésbica con la hostigación sexual de los hombres transactivistas. A finales de 2019 publiqué un ensayo titulado El mito de la orientación sexual, que según sé ha servido a muchas mujeres para tener una perspectiva construccionista de la sexualidad y movilizarlas hacia una mayor aceptación del feminismo lésbico, haciendo esto ver la barrera que supone este concepto. Mi perspectiva actual es que el concepto de orientación sexual que ahora manejamos es un híbrido entre lo que Celia Kitzinger llamó el modelo humanista liberal de la sexualidad y el innatismo más rígido que Shira también ha analizado en la herejía lesbiana. En la actualidad no se habla de nacer heterosexual, sino simplemente de no poder cambiarlo, de tener una orientación sexual donde el deseo, otro pilar irrevisado del liberalismo sexual, tiene poder sobre nosotras y nosotras ningún poder sobre él. Bajo esta premisa, muchas lesbianas han sido redirigidas a la organización con los hombres, apartándolas así del feminismo e impidiendo nuestra organización. Colectivos como la Alianza LGB no solo distraen a las lesbianas del feminismo y las exponen de nuevo a sus opresores, sino que en sí mismas se basan en conceptos antifeministas como el de la orientación sexual. Esto no solo nos hace renunciar a nuestra genealogía y teoría propia, también nos enfrenta a las unas con las otras en base a una cosmovisión completamente patriarcal. Es exactamente lo mismo que ocurre a las lesbianas en los colectivos LGBTIQ+, pero sin incluir las premisas queer o transactivistas. Otro problema es el intento de colonización del movimiento por parte de los hombres. El ejemplo de la alianza LGB revela una cierta ironía. Siendo las lesbianas y las mujeres en general las que hemos combatido la amenaza trans, parecería que necesitásemos dar espacio a los hombres para poder hacerlo desde la voz de las lesbianas. ¿Cómo hemos llegado a esta conclusión? Tan poca representación tenemos en el movimiento feminista en general, que la buscamos entre hombres con objetivos y problemáticas claramente distintos y hasta a veces contrarios a los nuestros. Las feministas lésbicas vemos el avance de las políticas trans como un asunto que tratar desde el feminismo, a riesgo de que si no lo hacemos consolidemos visiones patriarcales de las mujeres por el camino, como es en este caso. El intento de colonización trans en nuestros espacios hace que la mayoría de las mujeres tengan miedo a expresar su opinión, que no encontremos espacios seguros, que el riesgo de ostracismo, hostilidad y violencia sexual que ya afrontamos las mujeres se multiplique. Esta colonización es una emergencia que afecta a las mujeres de todo el mundo occidentalizado y al igual que ha hecho estragos en nuestros espacios y nuestras iniciativas, también nos ha movilizado a organizarnos. Las feministas lésbicas hemos intentado hacerlo de la forma más radical y constructiva posible, sin olvidar que el opresor al que no queremos en nuestros espacios no simplemente es el opresor que se dice mujer. Pasaré ahora a contaros qué hemos hecho. En la mayoría de los espacios organizativos, las lesbianas politizadas no éramos bien recibidas. En los espacios asamblearios y las asociaciones para lesbianas se nos impedía hablar bajo las amenazas de categorizarnos de tránsfogas, mientras que en los espacios supuestamente feministas radicales se nos atacaba llamándonos heterófobas o diciéndonos cosas tan hostiles y carentes de conciencia feminista como que las feministas lésbicas lo que queremos es que las mujeres heterosexuales nos coman el coño. Y esto es una cita real. Todas estas acciones acababan resultando en el ostracismo de las lesbianas concienciadas, impidiendo así la concienciación de las mujeres que aún no han examinado la heterosexualidad como institución, tanto lesbianas como no lesbianas. Por ejemplo, a mí se me expulsó hace 2 años del que por aquel entonces era el grupo de mensajería social más grande sobre feminismo gender critical, de todos los subgrupos en los que estaba, incluido el de lesbianas, alegando que las feministas lésbicas culpabilizábamos a las mujeres no lesbianas al hablar de la heterosexualidad como institución. Desde entonces, todo contenido producido por mí está baneado en esos grupos que se dicen feministas radicales. No se pueden compartir mis vídeos, mis escritos, ni mis cuentas en redes sociales. Incluso omitieron expresamente en el podcast de la comunidad decir mi nombre a la hora de hablar del último congreso en el que participé como organizadora y ponente cuando hablaron de él. Esta hostilidad ha impedido y obstaculizado nuestra organización en gran parte. Las lesbianas nos hemos tenido que silenciar o nos hemos cansado de la hostilidad y hemos acabado abandonando por completo estos espacios supuestamente feministas. Esto nos mantuvo en una especie de diáspora, que diría Mary Daly. Pese a las dificultades, hemos seguido buscando maneras de expandir nuestra conciencia feminista y poder vivir conforme a ella. Muchas de las acciones que hemos realizado buscaban directa o indirectamente subsanar los problemas que he presentado. Pasaré ahora a enumerar algunas de las iniciativas en las que participo. Para empezar, comenzaré hablando de la Abris Editorial, un proyecto que pusimos en marcha en 2020 para intentar mantener viva nuestra genealogía y tener la posibilidad de seguir organizándonos y crear los medios para realizar espacios separatistas. La Abris Editorial es una editorial feminista enfocada en el feminismo radical, que hasta ahora se ha centrado en traer obras que consideramos clave para el momento político, y que no estaban disponibles en nuestro idioma. Hemos traducido exclusivamente a feministas lesbianas y de momento pensamos seguir haciéndolo. Nuestro primer libro fue una colección de ensayos de Sheila Jeffries titulado Ensayos sobre políticas sexuales. El libro, que conformamos gracias a la cesión desinteresada de los derechos de uso por parte de su autora, sirvió para darnos el primer impulso y poder así publicar también su magnífico y tan necesario Gender Hearts, el género daño. Con estos dos libros introdujimos a muchas mujeres al pensamiento feminista radical y lésbico sobre cuestiones de gran actualidad y emergencia. Está claro que los aportes de Sheila Jeffries al movimiento son innegables y querer acercarse a su pensamiento radical ha hecho que muchas mujeres superen el tabú con respecto a las ideas del feminismo lésbico. Esta vía de concienciación alcanzó un punto álgido el pasado noviembre de 2021, cuando ante la posibilidad de la visita de Sheila a España para presentar sus dos libros, decidimos ponernos en marcha para generar la mayor conciencia lésbica posible. Esto acabó traduciéndose en la realización del primer Congreso Andaluz de Mujeres Abolicionistas, en cuya organización colaboró la Abris Editorial y en el que Sheila no solo presentó sus libros con nosotras, sino que nos ofreció una magnífica ponencia sobre feminismo lésbico que nos movilizó a todas profundamente. El Congreso sirvió para tratar y debatir gran cantidad de temas muy relevantes, pero también de punto de encuentro y construcción lésbica. Con una gran cantidad de ponentes lesbianas, la mayoría, y aún más lesbianas entre las asistentes, en 2 intensos días generamos lazos e iniciamos proyectos que aún siguen en pie y dando nuevos frutos. Uno de esos frutos es la creación de nuevos espacios de encuentro para mujeres feministas radicales y lesbianas, como es el de las compañeras de Barcelona que están ayudando a divulgar la teoría feminista radical y lésbica, creando, por ejemplo, un club de lectura en el que ya se han debatido capítulos de ensayos sobre políticas sexuales y donde pronto se debatirá el nuevo libro publicado por la Abris Editorial, Las políticas de la realidad, de la gran filósofa y feminista lésbica Marilyn Frey. Un libro que creemos que también servirá para dar bases sólidas a la conciencia feminista radical y a ver la potencialidad del feminismo lésbico y separatista. Por supuesto, el feminismo no se encuentra solo en los libros, la teoría nace de la experiencia. En noviembre de 2020 iniciamos el grupo internacional online de autoconciencia feminista lésbica llamado Reflexión Lésbica. Desde el grupo hemos profundizado en temas como la feminidad, la belleza o la pareja, la familia y la sexualidad como instituciones. También hemos hecho lecturas de distintos textos de teoría feminista lésbica y lectura comparativa con textos de otras corrientes, y hemos abierto las lecturas a las lesbianas interesadas a través de nuestras redes. Con esto hemos logrado no quedarnos en la reinvención de la rueda. Nos hemos ayudado las unas a las otras a llegar a las fuentes del feminismo lésbico, para formarnos, e intentamos hacer que llegue a las demás. También hemos iniciado el grupo activista Reacción Lésbica, en el que mujeres feministas lésbicas de España estamos organizando acciones de divulgación, movilización e intervención en nuestro territorio y que esperamos que nos lleve a generar más espacios propios, separatistas, y que sirva para que las lesbianas sepan dónde buscar a las mujeres afines para construir y seguir radicalizándose. El pasado 7 de marzo, Día de la Visibilidad Lésbica en Argentina, realizamos nuestra primera acción lanzando como parte de la agrupación internacional Lesbianas de la Munda un manifiesto lésbico radical que llamaba al separatismo. El manifiesto Mucho por ganar, únanse al aquelarre lésbico, ha sido firmado por decenas de lesbianas y traducido al francés, y actualmente está siendo también traducido al portugués y al inglés. Al día siguiente, en el 8M, asistimos a las marchas de España con nuestras pancartas lésbicas y muchas de nosotras repartimos el manifiesto. Nuestra organización se hace desde la red de mujeres lesbianas que estamos tejiendo, incluyendo las iniciativas creativas y de resistencia de cada una de nosotras. Nos caracteriza la voluntad de divulgación, de reflexión compartida y los lazos que estamos generando. Cabe recordar que nuestra organización y nuestro feminismo no serían los mismos sin la relación tan nutritiva que mantenemos con nuestras compañeras de América Latina, que se unen a nuestros espacios virtuales, que nos inspiran y acompañan, y con las que podemos debatir y aprender las unas de las otras. El feminismo lésbico se organiza desde, por y para el amor entre las mujeres, y en un ambiente feminista en el que por desgracia no revisa sus dinámicas de desprecio a ese amor y de permisividad, de hostilidad hacia las mujeres, llegar a los espacios lésbicos supone un oasis y una revolución en sí misma para muchas de nosotras. Muchas gracias.